Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss these long, calming history stories. It really helps us bring you more hours of relaxing narration every night. And tell me in the comments, what time is it where you're listening and from which part of the world? Always love to see where history is reaching across the globe. Asterisk, in the spring of 1857, the British Empire in India seemed unshakable. For a century, the East India Company had entrenched its rule, transforming a continent through trade, war, and bureaucracy. Yet, beneath the appearance of calm, resentment simmered. Taxation pressed hard on farmers. Land reforms displaced traditional elites. And sepoys, the Indian soldiers employed by the company, felt the sting of inequality every day. They were asked to fight in distant lands, paid less than their British counterparts, and treated with suspicion despite their loyalty. The British relied on them heavily, yet rarely trusted them. At the heart of this discontent stood Meerut, garrison town about 40 miles northeast of Delhi. It was an unremarkable place on the surface, dotted with barracks, parade grounds, and markets catering to the needs of soldiers. Yet, it would become the unlikely birthplace of one of the largest uprisings against the British Empire. The immediate spark was seemingly small: a new rifle cartridge. In 1857, the British introduced the Enfield rifle, requiring soldiers to bite open greased cartridges before loading the gunpowder and ball. Rumors spread swiftly that the cartridges were coated with cow and pig fat. For Hindu sepoys, cows were sacred. For Muslims, pigs were unclean. To bite such cartridges would be to betray faith. The British dismissed these concerns as superstition, but for the sepoys, it felt like a deliberate assault on their religion. This was not merely about a cartridge. It was about dignity, identity, and a deepening sense that foreign rulers neither understood nor respected Indian traditions. The cartridge rumor fused with decades of grievances into a potent symbol of oppression. In early May 1857, 85 sepoys at Meerut refused to accept the cartridges. They were tried in a British military court and sentenced to long prison terms. On May 9th, in full view of their comrades, they were stripped of uniforms, shackled, and marched to jail. The spectacle was meant to assert British authority, but instead it lit a fire. Soldiers who had fought alongside them for years felt humiliated and enraged. If loyal service ended in chains, what future was left for them? The next day, May 10th, 1857, was a Sunday. The British officers attended church, leaving the cantonment unusually quiet. Seizing the moment, sepoys broke into open mutiny. They freed their imprisoned comrades, set fire to officers' bungalows, and killed British soldiers and civilians caught in their path. Chaos erupted as flames rose and gunfire echoed through the garrison. Families fled on horseback or hid wherever they could. But the mutiny at Meerut was not just about vengeance. It was about movement. The sepoys knew their revolt would be crushed unless they found a rallying point, a symbol strong enough to unite fragmented forces. They turned toward Delhi, once the seat of the Mughal Empire, now reduced to a pensioned relic under company oversight. The aging emperor, Bahadur Shah II, better known as Bahadur Shah Zafar, had little real power, yet in the eyes of many Indians, he still carried the aura of legitimacy. By marching to Delhi, the rebels sought not just escape, but transformation. From mutiny to rebellion, from isolated act to empire-wide revolt, the march to Delhi was frantic and violent. Along the road, sepoys looted treasuries, killed company officials, and demanded villagers join them. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Peasants and dispossessed landlords alike seized the moment to settle old scores. Some attacked moneylenders who had trapped them in debt. Others turned against landlords allied with the British. It was not a single, coordinated revolution, but a storm of overlapping grievances. Meanwhile, the British at Meerut hesitated. Confusion reigned in the cantonment. Some officers urged immediate pursuit of the rebels, but hesitation and underestimation delayed action. The rebels entered Delhi almost unopposed, swarming through its gates and seizing the city. On May 11, 1857, Bahadur Shah Zafar, frail and weary, was thrust into the role of figurehead. Reluctantly, he gave his blessing to the rebellion. His name was inscribed on proclamations, coins were minted in his honor, and suddenly, what began as mutiny in a garrison town had transformed into a rebellion under the banner of the last Mughal emperor. Delhi became the symbolic heart of resistance. The British response was swift but scattered. Communications were slow, and commanders debated whether the events were an isolated mutiny or the beginning of something larger. Yet, as news of Meerut spread, so did the rebellion. From Awadh to Bundelkhand, from Bihar to central India, soldiers rose against their officers. Peasants attacked company outposts. In small towns, expelled colonial administrators. But in this first moment, this fragile spark of Meerut rebellion was still uncertain. Many sepoys hesitated. Would others join them? Would peasants rally behind their cause? Or would they be abandoned? Is Bahadur Shah Zafar truly a leader, or merely a fading symbol? As the sun set over Delhi, smoke rising from its crowded bazaars, one thing was certain: the rebellion had begun. Yet, what shape it would take, victory, defeat, or endless suffering, remained unclear, and so the question hangs. If the sepoys at Meerut had never risen, if those cartridges had been accepted without protest, would the British Empire's bloodiest rebellion have ever erupted at all? Delhi, in May of 1857, was no longer the capital of an empire, but it still held deep symbolic weight. The British had kept the Mughal emperor as a kind of living relic, confined to the Red Fort, his authority reduced to rituals, poetry, and the slow routines of a dying dynasty. Bahadur Shah Zafar was in his 80s, frail, more a poet than a ruler, and yet, to the sepoys who poured into the city after the uprising at Meerut, he represented legitimacy. When the sepoys reached the Red Fort on May 11th, their entry was anything but orderly. They demanded that the emperor take up their cause. At first, Bahadur Shah hesitated. He had spent years living under British surveillance, receiving a pension, riding gazelles, and quietly watching as the power of his ancestors vanished. He knew the company's strength. He had no illusions about the fragility of his position. To declare himself emperor again, to stand against the British, was to invite annihilation. But hesitation soon became impossible. The rebels surrounded the palace, shouting, demanding, and threatening. Without his blessing, their uprising lacked direction. With his name, it could unite soldiers and civilians alike. Whether out of fear, duty, or resignation, Bahadur Shah Zafar relented. He allowed himself to be proclaimed the symbolic leader of the rebellion. In that moment, local mutiny transformed into something larger, a rebellion draped in imperial legitimacy. The choice was fateful. Proclamations went out in his name, calling on Hindus and Muslims to unite, invoking the shared grievances against British rule. Coins were minted bearing his title. Delhi, once thought a relic of the past, became the center of resistance. Yet, the city itself was unprepared. Its walls were crumbling, its gates neglected, and its stores of ammunition insufficient. The rebels had passion, but not organization. Meanwhile, inside the city, fear and confusion spread among civilians. Delhi was a patchwork of artisans, traders, clerics, and poor laborers, each group calculating its chances of survival. Some welcomed the sepoys, hoping their arrival would loosen the grip of company taxation. Others feared looting, violence, and reprisals. The British residents, officials, soldiers' families, clerks were caught off guard. Many fled to the city's magazine, a massive arsenal of weapons and gunpowder, hoping to hold out until help arrived. But the rebels knew that the magazine was the key to controlling Delhi. On May 11th, they laid siege to it. Inside, a handful of British officers and Indian soldiers loyal to them resisted for hours. Outnumbered, they realized capture was inevitable. Rather than allow the arsenal to fall into rebel hands, they made a fateful decision. They ignited the gunpowder stores. The explosion was colossal, shaking the city, killing hundreds, and sending a black column of smoke into the sky. The rebels were stunned but undeterred. Within hours, they had taken control of Delhi. The capture of the city electrified northern India. Word traveled along dusty roads, across rivers, and through marketplaces. Delhi was free, the emperor restored. For peasants, disinherited princes, and disbanded soldiers, this news was intoxicating. It suggested that rebellion was not only possible, but spreading. Villages that had long borne the weight of land taxes saw a chance to throw off their burdens. Dispossessed aristocrats, stripped of estates by British reforms, saw an opening to reclaim power. The rebellion was not uniform, but it was contagious. At the same time, the British were slow to respond. In Meerut, the garrison that might have pursued the rebels hesitated. Orders were delayed, commanders quarreled, and the element of speed was lost. By the time the British began to organize, the rebels were entrenched in Delhi. The British response was also hampered by the structure of empire. The East India Company governed vast territories through a patchwork of treaties, alliances, and armies composed largely of Indian soldiers. When rebellion spread, trust shattered. Could any regiment be relied upon? Could any ally be counted on? Officers wrote frantic dispatches, unsure whether their own men would remain loyal or turn against them. The rebellion also exposed the vulnerability of British civilians. In towns and villages, families who had lived for years in relative security suddenly faced hostility. Rumors spread of massacres, some real, others exaggerated, and fear-hardened attitudes on both sides. The British began to speak not of restoring order, but of exacting vengeance. Inside Delhi, the situation was no less complex. The sepoys had restored the emperor's figurehead, but they had no unified command. Factions emerged among rebel leaders. Some demanded immediate offensives against British positions. Others sought to consolidate power. The emperor himself was torn between caution and symbolism. His sons and courtiers urged him to embrace leadership, but his own instincts leaned toward poetry, faith, and resignation. The court was a theater of indecision at a time when the rebellion demanded clarity. Daily life in Delhi became a mix of excitement and terror. Markets operated, but prices soared. Food grew scarce as supplies dwindled. Kiosks found work producing equipment for soldiers, but peasants arriving from the countryside added to the strain. Refugees poured in, while executions are suspected. Collaborators created an atmosphere of fear. The rebellion was not simply military, it reshaped the fabric of ordinary life. Beyond Delhi, the rebellion began to spread unevenly. In Awadh, resentment was especially deep. The annexation of the kingdom in 1856 had humiliated its nobility and displaced thousands of retainers. Now, with Delhi in rebellion, Awadh became one of the fiercest centers of resistance. Peasants there rose in arms, joined by dispossessed soldiers. In contrast, other regions remained quiet. In Punjab, for instance, many regiments stayed loyal, and the British used them to reinforce their fragile grip elsewhere. Yet, the pattern was unmistakable. A spark at Meerut had become a fire. Villages burned, treasuries were looted, and British officials who had once ruled with impunity were hunted. Each act of violence fueled the cycle further. The British, when they struck back, did so with equal or greater brutality, ensuring that reconciliation would be nearly impossible. And still, the questions persisted. Could a rebellion born from rumor and resentment truly sustain itself? Could fragmented groups of sepoys, peasants, and princes form a united front against the most powerful empire of the age? Or was this merely an eruption of anger destined to be crushed beneath the weight of discipline, artillery, and imperial determination? For now, in the summer of 1857, uncertainty ruled. The rebels held Delhi. The emperor's name was invoked. Across the land, in British rule, once thought eternal, looked fragile. Yet the foundations of rebellion were already showing cracks. Organization was poor, supplies inadequate, and leaders divided. The rebellion was vast, but was it strong enough to endure the storm that was surely coming? Night fell over Delhi, its streets choked with smoke from cooking fires and the remnants of battle. The emperor sat in his chambers, writing verses of lament. Outside, rebel soldiers celebrated their victories, but even then, a shadow hung over the city. For every cheer of freedom, there lingered the question, could this fragile rebellion withstand the empire's wrath when it finally arrived? Asterisk, the months that followed the capture of Delhi revealed both the strength and the fragility of the rebellion. On one hand, sight of sepoys and villagers rallying beneath the name of the Mughal emperor gave the uprising a legitimacy that spread fear through British ranks. On the other, Delhi's defenses were unsteady, its leadership fractured, and the rebels struggled to transform enthusiasm into endurance. The British, though slow to act at first, soon began to concentrate their forces. Reinforcements were drawn from Punjab, where loyalty to the company remained relatively intact. Sikh regiments, resentful of old rivalries with the Mughals, joined the British cause. Gurkha soldiers from Nepal were also brought in, their discipline and ferocity a contrast to the disorganized sepoys. Step by step, a counter-siege of Delhi was prepared. For the rebels inside the city, survival became increasingly difficult. Supplies dwindled, and coordination between different groups faltered. Leaders disagreed over strategy. Some argued for aggressive sorties against British camps, others for conserving strength within the city's walls. The Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was more poet than politician, and though his name inspired loyalty, his court was riddled with quarrels. Each passing week revealed a gap between the grandeur of the Mughal legacy and the practical needs of sustaining a rebellion. Daily life in Delhi under siege was marked by hardship. Food prices soared as markets emptied. Artisans struggled to provide weapons and equipment, while families scavenged for essentials. Disease spread in the crowded streets. Those who had once welcomed the rebels began to tire of their presence, particularly when looting and disorder disrupted ordinary routines. Meanwhile, British forces outside the city endured their own difficulties. The heat of the Indian summer was punishing. Soldiers collapsed under the sun, and cholera spread through the ranks. Supplies had to be carried over long distances, vulnerable to rebel raids. Yet, for all these hardships, the British maintained discipline. Their artillery positions tightened around the city. Engineers mapped the walls, seeking weak points for bombardment. The turning point came in September 1857. After weeks of bombardment, breaches appeared in Delhi's defenses. On September 14th, British troops stormed the city. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Street by street, house by house, the rebels resisted. Smoke filled the air, cries echoed in the alleys, and walls were scarred with cannon fire. Yet the weight of British discipline and firepower proved decisive. By the end of the week, Delhi had fallen. For the rebels, the defeat was devastating. Bahadur Shah Zafar fled the Red Fort, seeking refuge in the tomb of Humayun, a Mughal emperor of centuries past. There, he was captured. The British, eager to make an example, tried him not as a ruler, but as a rebel. His sons were executed, their bodies displayed as warnings. The emperor himself was exiled to Rangoon, far from the city that had once been the jewel of his dynasty. He died there in obscurity, his grave unmarked, his empire gone forever. Delhi's fall was more than the loss of a city, it was the collapse of a symbol. Without the Mughal emperor's figurehead, the rebellion lost its unifying thread. Though fierce resistance continued in places like Lucknow and Jhansi, the dream of a restored empire was shattered. What had begun at Meerut as a mutiny, and in Delhi as a rebellion crowned with legitimacy, now fractured into scattered struggles. Yet, the consequences of the rebellion went far beyond the battlefield. For the British, the uprising was both a shock and a lesson. The East India Company, discredited by its failure to prevent or contain the rebellion, was dissolved. In 1858, the governance of India was transferred directly to the British Crown. The Raj was born, and with it came new policies of control, stricter surveillance of the Indian Army, greater attention to religious sensitivities, and a deliberate effort to divide communities along lines of caste, creed, and loyalty. For Indians, the rebellion left scars, both physical and psychological. Cities lay in ruins, villages burned, and families shattered. Tens of thousands died, soldiers, peasants, civilians alike. The reprisals were merciless. Entire towns were punished, suspected rebels executed, and terror used to reassert control. Yet for all the suffering, the memory of 1857 endured. In the decades that followed, the uprising was remembered differently by different people. To the British, it became the Sepoy Mutiny, a tale of treachery and brutality, framed as a lesson in the dangers of trust. To many Indians, it was the first war of independence, a moment when diverse communities briefly united against foreign domination. The truth lay somewhere in between. It was neither a fully coordinated national movement, nor a mere outbreak of mutiny. It was a convergence of grievances, military, social, economic, and cultural, exploding into violence. And yet, the deeper significance of Meerut lingered. What had begun with a single refusal to bite a cartridge exposed the fragility of empire. It revealed that the might of the British relied not only on weapons, but on perceptions of legitimacy, loyalty, and order. When those perceptions cracked, rebellion became possible, even if only for a moment. As the 19th century wore on, the rebellion of 1857 became both cautionary tale and inspiration. Nationalists in the early 20th century looked back to it as proof that resistance, however flawed, was possible. British officials, meanwhile, cited it as justification for tighter rule. In this way, the echoes of Meerut shaped not only the end of the Mughal dynasty, but also the birth of modern Indian nationalism. Looking back, one cannot help but ask, what if the cartridges had never been greased with fat? What if the sepoys at Meerut had never refused? Would the empire have continued unchallenged for another century? Or was rebellion inevitable in a land burdened by taxation, dispossession, and disregard for tradition? The spark at Meerut did not bring down the British Empire, but it illuminated its cracks. And in those cracks, future generations would find the seeds of resistance. Asterisk. In the summer of 1857, Delhi became the eye of the storm. What began in the cantonment of Meerut spread swiftly across northern India, but Delhi was a place where rebellion became symbol. To hold the city was to challenge the very foundation of British authority. To lose it was to surrender the illusion of permanence that the empire projected. For centuries, Delhi had been the capital of empire's Hindu dynasties, sultans, and finally, the Mughals, whose Red Fort stood as a monument to faded grandeur. Though by 1857, the Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, ruled over little more than memory. His presence gave legitimacy to the sepoys who swarmed into the city after the revolt at Meerut. They raised him up as the figurehead of their cause, not because he commanded armies or wealth, but because he embodied continuity with India's imperial past. The capture of Delhi by rebels in May sent shockwaves through the British establishment. To many in India, it appeared that the British had been humbled, their officials driven out, their arsenals captured. The proclamations issued in the emperor's name spoke of unity between Hindu and Muslim, of vengeance against foreign rulers, and of a return to a world where sovereignty belonged to the land itself rather than to distant merchants and monarchs. Yet holding Delhi was not simple. The city, sprawling and teeming with artisans, merchants, and laborers, was not designed to sustain a long siege. Its walls, though imposing, were outdated against modern artillery. Its gates, once the pride of empire, were neglected. Within, resources were limited and leadership uncertain. The rebels had numbers but lacked cohesion. For the British, regaining Delhi became an obsession. It was not just a matter of military necessity, but of symbolic survival. To lose Delhi permanently was to invite rebellion elsewhere. To retake it would reassert authority and send a message of vengeance. The task fell. Two forces mustered from Punjab, where Sikh regiments and loyal Indian units formed the backbone of the counteroffensive. They were joined by British troops drawn from across the empire, hardened by campaigns in Afghanistan and Burma, now tasked with besieging a city that had once been the jewel of India. The road to Delhi was perilous. Rebel forces harassed convoys, and villages turned hostile. Yet, by June 1857, British forces began to converge on the ridge, a rocky outcrop north of the city that would serve as their base for months. From there, they could bombard the walls and plan assaults. The siege of Delhi had begun. Inside the city, life was transformed. Markets became supply depots, and mansions turned into barracks. The emperor's court, once devoted to poetry and ceremony, became a stage for conflicting demands from sepoy leaders. Each regiment wanted recognition, each commander sought authority, and discipline suffered. Looting and disorder alienated civilians, even as they remained dependent on the rebels for protection. For ordinary people, survival became the central concern. Food prices rose steeply. Grain that once flowed into the city from surrounding villages was now cut off by British patrols. Families rationed their meals, and artisans struggled to find work as demand shifted from fine goods to crude tools of war. Disease spread quickly in the crowded lanes, carried by stagnant water and poor sanitation. Delhi's ordinary residents, who had no say in the rebellion or the siege, bore the heaviest burden. The rebels, though energized at first, soon faced the realities of sustaining a war. Ammunition was scarce. Many soldiers carried outdated muskets or makeshift weapons. Efforts to manufacture cartridges in the city met with limited success. Morale fluctuated, rising with each rumor of victory elsewhere, sinking with every rumor of British reinforcements. Meanwhile, the British position on the ridge was grim but resolute. The heat of the Indian summer was punishing. Soldiers collapsed from sunstroke, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their bodies weakened by dysentery and cholera. Supplies were precarious. Water had to be hauled from wells under constant threat of rebel fire. Yet discipline held. Artillery batteries were positioned, trenches dug, and plans laid for a slow strangulation of the city. The ridge itself became a place of endurance. From there, the British could see the domes and minarets of Delhi shimmering in the distance, tantalizing yet defiant. Skirmishes broke out daily. Rebel sharpshooters harassed British positions, while sorties from the city tested the besiegers' resolve. The constant crack of musket fire and the thunder of cannons became the background to life. For 3 months, the siege dragged on. Neither side gained a decisive edge. The rebels, though numerous, could not break the encirclement. The British, though disciplined, lacked the strength for a full assault. The stalemate bred suffering. Inside Delhi, hunger gnawed at civilians. Outside, disease thinned the ranks of BES-IEGERS. Letters from those months revealed the wariness on both sides. British officers wrote of heat, dust, and the endless labor of maintaining trenches. Rebel proclamations boasted of victories but hinted at shortages. Traders who once carried spices and silks now dealt in rumors, carrying news of battles elsewhere. Lucknow besieged, Cawnpur aflame, Jhansi in revolt. Each tale reminded those in Delhi that their struggle was part of something larger, even if its outcome remained uncertain. And yet, despite all the hardship, both sides clung to the city. For the rebels, Delhi was the heart of legitimacy. Without it, their cause would fragment. For the British, its loss was intolerable. Without its recovery, their empire might crumble. The siege was not just a battle of armies, but of endurance, symbols, and will. As August gave way to September, the stalemate neared its end. Reinforcements arrived for the British, bringing heavy artillery and fresh troops. Plans for an assault were drawn. Inside the city, supplies ran desperately low, and quarrels among leaders deepened. The stage was set for a storm that would decide the fate of Delhi and, in many ways, the rebellion itself. But as the cannons on the ridge were wheeled into position, one question hung heavy in the minds of both besiegers and besieged. When the final assault came, would Delhi emerge as the beacon of freedom the rebels had imagined, or would it become the graveyard of their hopes? Asterisk, by early September 1857, Delhi had endured nearly 4 months of siege. The city's once bustling bazaars, where merchants had traded in silks, spices, and jewels, now stood half empty. The Red Fort, once a palace of poetry and refinement, had become the rebel court, its marble halls echoing not with gazelles, but with the tense arguments of sepoy leaders. The city that symbolized imperial memory was becoming exhausted outside its walls. On the ridge, the British built up their strength. Reinforcements had arrived in August, columns from Punjab, battalions of Sikh soldiers, and detachments of Gurkhas from Nepal. With them came heavier artillery, the kind that could breach Delhi's crumbling walls. British commanders knew that time alone would not bring victory. The city had to be stormed. The artillery preparations began in earnest. On September 7th, heavy guns were dragged into position, their iron barrels pointed toward Delhi's walls. Soldiers labored in the oppressive heat, constructing batteries under constant fire from rebel sharpshooters. Each night, the ridge flickered with the light of cannon fire as shells whistled through the sky and slammed into the city. For days, the bombardment continued, shaking the ancient walls, toppling bastions, and filling the air with dust. Inside Delhi, the effect was devastating. Houses near the walls collapsed, burying families beneath rubble. Minarets crumbled, their graceful silhouettes shattered by explosions. Civilians cowered in courtyards, praying that the next shell would fall elsewhere. The rebels, desperate to maintain morale, promised that the city's walls would hold, but cracks widened with each passing day. Ammunition was scarce, and food scarcer still. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the emperor at the heart of the rebellion, remained a tragic figure. In his 80s, frail and weary, he was little more than a symbol. His sons urged him to show strength, but his instinct was for poetry and reflection. Each morning he recited verses, even as cannons thundered outside the palace. His courtiers argued over strategy, some advocating for desperate sorties, others clinging to the hope of relief from elsewhere. But no relief came. The sepoys themselves grew restless. Many were veterans of the company's army, skilled soldiers, but they lacked coordination. Leadership was divided among dozens of officers, each commanding his own regiment, each reluctant to yield authority. Plans were made and abandoned. Some regiments fought bravely, others faltered. Discipline frayed under the pressure of siege. For civilians, survival became unbearable. Grain that once sold cheaply now cost a fortune. Women pawned jewelry to buy rice. Men sold heirlooms for a handful of flour. Water grew foul, carrying disease. Corpses lay unburied in alleys, adding stench to misery. The rebellion that had once promised liberation was now consuming the city from within. Meanwhile, the British siege lines hardened. Their camp on the ridge was no paradise. Cholera and dysentery claimed many lives, and the heat broke men as surely as bullets, but discipline and supplies sustained them. Engineers identified weak points along Delhi's northern walls. The Kashmiri Gate, the Water Bastion, and the Kabul Gate were selected as targets for the final assault. On September 13th, the bombardment reached its climax. Cannons roared without pause, belching fire and smoke. Key stones flew from the walls. Bastions collapsed, and the defenders struggled to return fire. The noise was deafening, the air thick with dust. By evening, breaches were visible. The city, though still standing, was vulnerable. That night, both sides prepared for the inevitable. In the British camp, officers read out orders. The assault would begin at dawn. Soldiers sharpened bayonets, cleaned muskets, and whispered prayers. Some wrote final letters, unsure if they would see another day. In Delhi, rebels reinforced barricades, piling carts and timber in narrow streets, determined to resist house by house if the walls fell. Civilians huddled in fear, caught between hope for survival and dreaded destruction. At dawn on September 14th, the assault began. British columns surged toward the breaches. The first storming party charged the Kashmir Gate, carrying powder bags. To blow it open, under heavy fire, they ran across open ground, many cut down before reaching the wall. Those who survived placed the charges, lit the fuses, and the gate exploded in a cloud of smoke and debris. Cheers rose from the ridge as British troops poured through. The fighting inside the city was ferocious. Streets became battlefields, barricades contested with bayonets and cannon. Rebels fired from rooftops and windows, forcing the attackers to clear each house methodically. Blood ran through the alleys, mingling with dust and rubble. The grandeur of Delhi's bazaars gave way to carnage as soldiers advanced inch by inch. For days, the struggle continued. The Water Bastion fell, then the Kabul Gate. The Red Fort, once the seat of emperors, was surrounded. On September 20th, Bahadur Shah Zafar surrendered. Taken into custody, he was spared execution but condemned to exile. His sons were less fortunate, captured and executed by British officers. Their bodies left on display as warnings. The city, once the heart of rebellion, lay in ruins. Thousands of civilians were killed, whether by cannon fire, street fighting, or reprisals. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, homes looted, mosques desecrated. The British, enraged by months of siege and stories of massacres elsewhere, exacted vengeance without restraint. Delhi became not just a conquered city, but a symbol of retribution. For the rebels who survived, Delhi's fall was crushing. Without the emperor, without the city, the rebellion lost coherence. Resistance continued in places like Lucknow and Jhansi. But the dream of a restored Mughal empire was gone. And yet, in the silence after the guns, one question lingered. Had Delhi fallen because the British were stronger, or because the rebellion, for all its passion, lacked the unity to sustain itself? Asterisk. The fall of Delhi in September 1857 was not merely the loss of a city, it was the collapse of a symbol. For months, the rebels had clung to the idea that the Mughal emperor's name could unite a fragmented uprising. For months, the British had endured heat, disease, and heavy casualties on the ridge in order to take the city back. When Delhi finally fell, both sides understood that the rebellion had passed a decisive turning point in the days after the assault. The city resembled a battlefield long after the fighting had ended. Streets were littered with rubble and corpses. The once bustling Chandni Chowk, with its merchants and jewelers, lay silent. Shops were shuttered, houses abandoned, and temples and mosques scarred by cannon fire. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and decay. The British, exhausted but victorious, gave little mercy. Retribution was swift and brutal. Civilians suspected of aiding rebels were hanged in public squares. Entire neighborhoods were emptied as soldiers went house to house, seizing food, valuables, and sometimes lives. Delhi's population, once hundreds of thousands, dwindled to a fraction. For survivors, daily life became a constant negotiation with hunger, fear, and the unpredictable wrath of occupying troops. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, embodied the tragedy of the city. Captured at Humayun's tomb, he was paraded not as a sovereign, but as a prisoner. Tried by a British military tribunal, he was accused of treason despite his limited role in directing the rebellion. His sons Mirza, Mughal, Khizr Sultan, and Abu Bakr executed without trial, their bodies displayed near the Kuni Darwaza, the Gate of Blood. The emperor himself was spared execution, but sentenced to exile in Rangoon, relived his final years writing mournful poetry. His grave, unmarked for decades, became a symbol of forgotten sovereignty. For the British, retaking Delhi was more than military victory. It was a statement. The empire had bent, but not broken. The East India Company, shaken by the scale of the uprising, used the city's fall to reassert its dominance. Yet, even as they celebrated, doubts lingered. The cost of victory had been immense. Thousands of soldiers had died, and vast sums had been spent. The rebellion was not over. It raged in Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, and beyond, but the psychological blow to rebels everywhere was undeniable. Inside British ranks, the siege of Delhi became both a story of endurance and a justification for cruelty. Officers wrote of comrades buried in shallow graves on the ridge, of cholera decimating regiments, of long months under fire. They spoke of vengeance as a necessary response to rebel treachery. The narrative of betrayal, particularly after reports of massacres of British civilians at places like Kanpur, hardened attitudes. Too many British soldiers. Delhi was not just a city to retake, but a place to punish. For rebels, Delhi's fall was catastrophic. The emperor's name had given them unity, however fragile. Without him, the rebellion fractured. Leaders elsewhere continued to resist, but the dream of a restored Mughal empire was gone. What remained were scattered uprisings, fierce, determined, but increasingly isolated. The city itself was transformed. For the rebellion, the British imposed sweeping changes. Its entire neighborhoods were demolished to create open spaces where cannons could fire freely should unrest return. Many of Delhi's residents were expelled, their homes confiscated. Mosques were converted into barracks or stables. The Red Fort, once a palace of emperors, became a garrison. Delhi, long a jewel of Indian culture and politics, was reshaped into a symbol of imperial authority. The rebellion had revealed more than Angrid had exposed the fragility of British rule. An empire that seemed unshakable had nearly been undone by its own army. That realization would have lasting consequences. In 1858, the East India Company was formally dissolved, and governance of India passed directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became the figurehead of empire in India, and the Raj was born. Policies shifted in the rebellion's aftermath. The British restructured their army, reducing reliance on Indian sepoys from regions most associated with rebellion, and increasing recruitment from communities considered loyal, such as Sikhs and Gurkhas. Greater attention was paid to religious sensitivities, no more greased cartridges to spark mutiny. At the same time, surveillance and control deepened. Caste, religion, and region were used to divide, ensuring no single group could unite, as in 1857. For Indians, the memory of Delhi's siege endured as both trauma and inspiration. Trauma, because the city had been shattered, its population decimated, its emperor humiliated. Inspiration, because for a brief moment, it had stood as a rallying point against foreign rule. Later generations of nationalists would look back to 1857 and to Delhi as proof that resistance, however costly, was possible. Letters, poems, and oral traditions preserved the memory. Some spoke of suffering mothers searching for food, children lost in the chaos, men hanged without trial. Others spoke of courage sepoys who stood firm at the barricades, civilians who risked their lives to shelter fugitives. The rebellion was neither wholly organized nor wholly chaotic. It was a tapestry of human responses to oppression. The siege of Delhi, in its brutality and its symbolism, shaped the course of Indian history. It ended one dynasty, the Mughals, and confirmed another, the British Raj. It revealed both the power of symbols and their limits, how a city could inspire rebellion, and how its fall could shatter dreams. And so, in the quiet that followed, with Delhi's ruins smoldering and its emperor in exile, one question lingered like dust over the city's broken walls. Did Delhi fall because of the strength of empire? Or because the rebellion, though passionate, was never truly united enough to hold it? If Delhi was the symbolic heart of the rebellion, Lucknow became its long, suffocating struggle. Situated in the province of Awadh, annexed by the British only a year before the uprising, Lucknow embodied the grievances that drove so many into revolt. The annexation had humiliated the local nobility, displaced thousands of soldiers, and disrupted the intricate networks of patronage that sustained everyday life. When rebellion swept across northern India in 1857, Lucknow was primed for upheaval. At the center of the drama was the residency, a sprawling complex of buildings where British officials, soldiers, and their families took shelter when the rebellion reached the city. What had once been the administrative hub of company power in Awadh became a fortress under siege. For months, the residency's defenders endured bombardment, hunger, and disease, waiting for relief that always seemed too far away. The siege of Lucknow began in late June 1857, when rebel forces composed of sepoys, disaffected nobles, and ordinary peasants surrounded the residency. Inside were roughly 3,000 people, including around 1,700 soldiers, many of them loyal Indian troops, alongside hundreds of women and children. The residency's walls were not designed for prolonged defense, but the British and their allies hastily fortified them, erecting barricades, digging trenches, and mounting artillery on rooftops. The rebels, emboldened by victories elsewhere, launched daily assaults. Cannon fire shook the buildings. Musket shots rang out from hidden positions. Snipers targeted anyone who exposed themselves. The residency became a place of constant danger. Windows were bricked up to prevent bullets from finding targets inside. Courtyards, filled with rubble, served as makeshift redoubts. For the civilians trapped within, life became a grim routine of fear and survival. Food supplies quickly dwindled. Rice, flour, and lentils were rationed. Meat became a luxury, and when animals inside the compound were slaughtered, every scrap was consumed. Water, drawn from wells, sometimes ran foul. Disease spread in the cramped quarters. Cholera, dysentery, and fever claimed lives as relentlessly as rebel bullets. The medical staff worked tirelessly, but resources were limited. Surgeries were performed with minimal instruments, and medicines ran out. The presence of women and children made the siege particularly harrowing. Letters and diaries from survivors described nights filled with the cries of hungry children, mothers attempting to soothe them, and families praying for relief. Children too young to understand the rebellion grew up quickly, learning to avoid windows, to stay silent during bombardments, and to live with the constant fear of death. Rebel artillery pounded the residency day after day. Walls crumbled, roofs collapsed, and buildings became shells of stone and dust. Graves filled the gardens as casualties mounted. Funerals were hurried affairs, conducted under fire, with shallow pits dug in the earth. The dead were often buried where they fell. The residency, once a symbol of company rule, became a graveyard. Yet within the compound, discipline held. The defenders, both British and Indian, organized themselves into shifts, manned barricades, and rationed supplies. Daily routines helped maintain morale. Prayers, drills, and the distribution of food provided a semblance of order amidst chaos. Civilians contributed as best they could, tending to the wounded, preparing food, or carrying water under fire. Survival depended on collective endurance. Outside the residency, Lucknow was transformed by the rebellion. Rebel leaders, many drawn from Awad's displaced nobility, sought to restore authority stripped away by annexation. The cities, palaces, and gardens, once symbols of courtly elegance, became barracks and arsenals. Markets supplied the rebel army, though shortages grew as the siege dragged on. Ordinary residents of Lucknow, caught between rebels and besieged, adapted as best they could. Some profited by selling supplies, others fled into the countryside, and many simply endured. The wider rebellion shaped events at Lucknow. News of Delhi's capture by rebels in May had inspired confidence, but by September, when Delhi fell to the British, uncertainty spread. Rumors flew of victories and defeats, each shaping morale. For the rebels, Lucknow became a crucial front. If they could hold it, the rebellion might endure even after Delhi's loss. For the British, relieving the residency became a matter of prestige. To abandon those trapped inside would signal weakness. To rescue them would prove the empire's resilience. Messages smuggled out of the residency described the desperation. Within each day, without relief, meant more hunger, more graves, more despair. The defenders clung to hope, scanning the horizon for signs of approaching reinforcements. But relief columns, marching through hostile territory, faced their own challenges on bushes, heat, and stretched supply lines. Weeks turned into months, and still the residency endured. Life inside became a blur of endurance. Families marked time not by calendars, but by the rhythm of bombardments and funerals. Children celebrated birthdays with scraps of food. Adults remembered anniversaries with whispered prayers. The passing of time itself seemed suspended, as if life had shrunk to the confines of a besieged compound. And yet, even in such circumstances, small details mattered. Letters tell of women planting flowers in broken gardens, of soldiers sharing jokes to mask fear, of children playing with scraps of wood fashioned into toys. These fragile acts of normalcy were ways of resisting despair. By October, the residency had been under siege for over 3 months. Ammunition was running low, food almost gone, and the defenders were exhausted. The rebels, too, were weary, their assaults less frequent, but no less dangerous. Both sides seemed locked in a struggle of attrition. The defenders could only ask the same question, day after day: when will relief come? The story of Lucknow's residency was not yet finished. Relief would come, but slowly, and at terrible cost. For now, in the late autumn of 1857, the compound stood as a symbol of endurance beleaguered, battered, and waiting. And so, the unresolved question hung heavy in the smoke-filled air of Lucknow. Would relief arrive in time to save the besieged? Or would the residency become a monument to sacrifice and loss? Asterisk. By October 1857, the residency at Lucknow had been under siege for more than 3 months. The compound was a ruin. Walls pocked with cannon shot stood precariously. Roofs collapsed under bombardment, and entire wings of buildings lay in rubble. The defenders, soldiers, civilians, women, and children moved through debris-strewn courtyards, as though in a city of the dead. Yet, the residency endured. Relief had been promised, but each rumor of approaching reinforcements faded into disappointment. The defenders lived in cycles of hope and despair, rallying at news of a column on the march, then sinking back into weary routine. When days passed without rescue, time became blurred. Mornings began with artillery fire, nights ended with hurried burials. In between were moments of silence, heavy with the knowledge that at any instant, the bombardment could resume. Food supplies had reached desperate levels. Horses and mules, once used for transport, were slaughtered for meat. Bread was baked from grain ground with makeshift stones. Families counted each ration, stretching meals as long as possible. Diaries from survivors speak of gnawing hunger, of children begging for food that did not exist, of mothers dividing their portions so the young could survive. Water, though still available, was often fouled, carrying dysentery and fever through the compound. The medical staff faced impossible conditions. Surgeons worked in makeshift hospitals filled with wounded from daily skirmishes. Amputations were performed without proper anesthetics. Bandages were reused until they disintegrated. Disease spread rapidly, claiming lives silently while cannons thundered outside. More died from illness than from bullets, and graves filled quickly. And yet, within this ordeal, life persisted. Women organized themselves into support roles, tending to the sick, preparing food, and comforting children. Some took on tasks traditionally reserved for soldiers, carrying water under fire, distributing ammunition, even standing watch when the need arose. Diaries revealed their resilience, not tales of heroics in the grand sense, but the steady labor of keeping others alive. The rebels outside the walls maintained pressure, but faced challenges of their own. Their numbers were large, but resources strained. Maintaining a siege required constant supplies of food and ammunition, and the countryside, already weary from months of fighting, could not endlessly provide. Some leaders argued for a final assault to end the stalemate, while others feared the losses such an attack would bring. Rebel morale rose and fell, with rumors from other fronts daily lost. Kanpur contested, Jhansi aflame. Each story shaped their resolve. The city of Lucknow itself bore the weight of rebellion. Palaces were fortified, gardens turned into camps, and bazaars adapted to war. Ordinary residents lived between two worlds. Some supplied the rebels, willingly or under compulsion. Others tried to maintain fragments of normal life. Temples, mosques, and shrines became shelters, their courtyards filled with displaced families. The grandeur of Awad's capital, with its elegant architecture and refined culture, was scarred by cannon fire and hardship. Relief finally came into sight in late September, when Sir Henry Havelock, leading a small British column, fought his way from Cawnpore toward Lucknow. His force, composed of British soldiers and loyal Indian regiments, endured heat, disease, and fierce resistance along the road. Each mile was contested. By the time he reached the outskirts of Lucknow, his numbers were reduced and his men exhausted. On September 25, 1857, Havelock's column entered the city. The march through Lucknow was a running battle, with rebels firing from rooftops, alleys, and barricades. Civilians hid in fear as streets became killing grounds. The column hacked its way forward, street by street, losing men at every step. By evening, they reached the residency and fought their way inside. The moment of relief was bittersweet. Defenders and civilians wept with joy as the weary column entered, but hope quickly turned to disappointment. Havelock's force was too small, too weakened to break the siege entirely. Rather than lifting the encirclement, his arrival merely reinforced the garrison. The siege continued, now with more mouths to feed and no end in sight. Conditions worsened. Supplies dwindled further, and disease spread more quickly in the crowded compound. Morale sank as realization set in. Relief had arrived, but salvation had not. For weeks, Havelock and the defenders held out, waiting for yet another relief column. Messages were smuggled out, desperate pleas sent through perilous routes, each carrying the same cry: "We are still holding, but we cannot endure forever." By mid-October, Sir Colin Campbell, the newly appointed commander-in-chief in India, prepared a larger relief effort. Drawing forces from Punjab, Gurkhas from Nepal, and reinforcements from across the empire, he began his march toward Lucknow. But distances were long, and rebel resistance fierce. Each step forward cost time and lives. The Residency's defenders, meanwhile, continued their daily cycle of bombardments, hunger, and funerals. The psychological toll was immense. Diaries described nights filled with restless silence, broken only by the thud of artillery and the cries of the wounded. Mothers wrote of watching their children waste away. Soldiers wrote of digging graves for comrades without ceremony. Yet the defenders endured, clinging to discipline, faith, and the hope that relief would arrive before the end. Outside the walls, rebels debated their next moves. Some pressed for a final assault, convinced the garrison was near collapse. Others argued that time itself would destroy the defenders. But as news of British reinforcements filtered in, unease spread. The rebellion, once buoyed by the capture of Delhi, now faced setbacks. If Lucknow fell, it would be a triumph. If it endured, it would become a symbol of British resilience. And so, the siege dragged into November, with both sides locked in exhaustion. The Residency, reduced to rubble, still held. The rebels, though numerous, had not broken through. Relief was marching, but slowly, and the outcome remained uncertain in those long weeks. One question haunted everyone trapped in Lucknow: would Sir Colin Campbell's relief arrive in time? Or would the Residency, like so many other places in 1857, end in massacre and ruin? Asterisk, by November 1857, the Residency at Lucknow had become a symbol of endurance. For nearly 5 months, soldiers, civilians, women, and children had survived amidst rubble, bombardment, hunger, and disease. The arrival of Havelock's column in September had bolstered their numbers, but not lifted the siege. Hope now rested on Sir Colin Campbell, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in India, who was assembling a larger relief effort. Campbell's march toward Lucknow was deliberate. He commanded a composite force British regiments hardened by service in Crimea and Afghanistan, Sikh units drawn from Punjab, and Gurkhas from Nepal. They advanced cautiously, wary of ambushes along the road. Rebel forces resisted fiercely, turning villages, bridges, and groves into battlegrounds. Each step forward required artillery bombardments, bayonet charges, and relentless skirmishing. Yet the column pressed on, determined to reach the beleaguered Residency. Inside Lucknow, conditions worsened daily. Food was nearly gone. Families survived on scraps, eking out meals from whatever could be scavenged. Horses had long been eaten. Leather was boiled into thin soup. Children weakened, their cries fading into silence. Disease thinned the population relentlessly. Graves filled the Residency's gardens. Fresh mounds of earth marked each passing day. The defenders' uniforms were in tatters, their weapons worn, their bodies hollow with fatigue. Yet they refused to surrender. Rebel forces outside the walls remained determined. They continued bombardments, sniping from rooftops and launching probing assaults. But discipline had begun to fray. Months of siege had drained supplies and news from elsewhere. In India, Delhi, fallen, Kanpur, contested, Jhansi aflame shook morale. Still, they knew that to abandon Lucknow would be to abandon the rebellion's hopes in Awadh. The city had become more than a battlefield. It was the heart of resistance. On November 14th, Campbell's column reached the outskirts of Lucknow. Relief attempt was unlike Havelock's desperate dash 2 months earlier. This time, the force was larger, better supplied, and equipped with heavy artillery. Yet, the challenge was immense. The rebels had fortified the city, turning palaces, mosques, and gardens into strongholds. To reach the residency, Campbell's men would have to fight through dense urban terrain, where every street and courtyard could conceal resistance. The assault began with methodical precision. Artillery bombarded rebel positions, while infantry advanced cautiously behind cover. The Sikandar Bagh, once a pleasure garden, became a fortress manned by thousands of rebels. Campbell ordered an attack. After fierce fighting, British and Sikh troops stormed the enclosure, bayonets flashing, muskets cracking. When the battle ended, hundreds of rebels lay dead amidst shattered walls and blood-soaked earth. The Sikandar Bagh became a grim emblem of the relief effort's brutality. Day by day, Campbell's troops fought their way closer. Each stronghold palaces with ornate facades, mosques with soaring domes. Gardens once filled with fountains was reduced to rubble. The elegance of Lucknow was consumed by fire and shot. Rebels fought tenaciously, forcing the attackers to clear every building with bayonet and cannon. Progress was slow, costly, and merciless. Inside the residency, the sound of battle drew nearer. Defenders, gaunt with hunger and fever, strained to hear each volley, each cannon shot, wondering if salvation was finally at hand. On November 17th, Campbell's column broke through to the compound. Soldiers and civilians rushed to greet them, some weeping, others too exhausted to show emotion. Relief had arrived, yet the victory was incomplete. Campbell, surveying the situation, realized the residency was untenable. The defenders were too weakened, the compound too shattered, and supplies too scarce to sustain further siege. Holding it against renewed rebel attacks would be disastrous. He made the difficult decision. The residency would be abandoned. The evacuation was carried out with quiet urgency. Under cover of night, civilians and the wounded were escorted out, slipping through corridors of destruction as soldiers held back the rebels. Women and children clutched what little they could carry. The sick and wounded were borne on stretchers. The defenders, who had endured months of horror, now left behind the ruins that had defined their survival. By November 22nd, the residency was empty. The march out of Lucknow was perilous. Rebels harassed the retreat, firing from rooftops and alleys, but Campbell's disciplined columns kept order. Slowly, painfully, the survivors were brought to safety. For the first time in nearly half a year, those who had endured the siege breathed free air beyond the residency's walls. The evacuation was not the end of the struggle for Lucknow. The city remained in rebel hands, and it would take another campaign in 1858 for the British to recapture it fully. But the siege itself was over for the defenders. Survival was triumph enough. The human cost, however, was staggering. Of the roughly 3,000 who had entered the residency in June, more than half were dead, killed by shot, shell, disease, or starvation. The survivors carried scars, physical and psychological, that would remain for life. Letters written afterward speak of haunted memories, the cries of children, the endless funerals, the nights spent waiting for shells to fall. The residency became both a monument to suffering and a rallying cry for British resolve. For the British public, the siege of Lucknow became legend. Newspapers printed dramatic accounts of endurance, framing the defenders as heroes who held out against overwhelming odds. Paintings and engravings depicted women and children under fire, soldiers manning crumbling barricades, and the moment of relief. The story fed into a narrative of imperial resilience, shaping how the rebellion was remembered in Britain. For Indians, the memory was different. Lucknow symbolized both the ferocity of resistance and the devastation wrought by war. The city's palaces and gardens, once celebrated for elegance and refinement, lay scarred by cannon fire to Kyone, or the heaviest toll caught between rebels and besiegers, their lives appended by a conflict they did not choose. The rebellion in Nawad continued, but the siege marked a turning point, proof that endurance alone could not overcome the empire's relentless resources. The residency itself, left in ruins, was never rebuilt. It became a memorial, preserved, as it was after the siege, walls shattered, buildings gutted, graves scattered through its gardens. Its visitors, both British and Indian, came to see the place where so many had died. To the British, it was a site of heroic defense. To Indians, it was a site of shared suffering, emblematic of the costs of empire. The endless siege of Lucknow left a question that lingered long after the guns fell silent. Had the defenders survived because of their discipline, or because the rebels, despite their passion, lacked the coordination to finish what they had begun? Asterisk, in June 1857, as rebellion spread across northern India, the city of Kanpur became the site of one of the rebellion's most haunting tragedies. Nestled on the banks of the Ganges River, Kanpur was not a grand capital, like Delhi or Lucknow, but it was an important garrison town. Its location on river routes and roads made it a vital link in the chain of British military and administrative control. When rebellion erupted, Kanpur became both a battlefield and a graveyard. At the center of the events was an unlikely figure, Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the last Peshwa of the Maratha Empire. Denied a pension by the British after his father's death, Nana Sahib had long harbored resentment. In 1857, when sepoys mutinied in nearby garrisons, Nana Sahib saw his opportunity. He presented himself as a leader of the rebellion, blending personal grievance with the larger cause of resistance to British rule. For rebels, his name carried legitimacy, recalling the once mighty Maratha Confederacy. The siege of Kanpur began in late June, when rebel sepoys and Nana Sahib's forces surrounded the British entrenchment. Inside were around 900 soldiers, civilians and families, including women and children. The British, caught unprepared, had hastily fortified a patch of open ground with mud, walls, and shallow trenches. Supplies were limited, wells quickly fouled, and the defenders endured the scorching heat of the Indian summer with little shelter. Life inside the entrenchment was brutal. Rebel artillery pounded the flimsy defenses daily. Food and water ran scarce within weeks, spread in the unsanitary conditions, striking down soldiers and civilians alike. Diaries from survivors speak of unbearable thirst, of children crying for water, of soldiers collapsing from heat and exhaustion. Each day brought more casualties, and graves were dug within the entrenchment to bury the dead quickly. The defenders held out for 3 weeks, clinging to the hope of relief. But Kanpur was isolated, and British forces elsewhere were stretched thin. As their situation worsened, Nana Sahib opened negotiations. He promised safe passage to Allahabad if the defenders surrendered. Desperate, the British accepted. They believed they would be allowed to march to the river, board boats, and sail away to safety. On June 27, 1857, the survivors of the entrenchment, fewer than half their original number, marched to the banks of the Ganges. Women carried children, soldiers limped from wounds, and the exhausted column moved slowly under the hot sun. At the river, boats waited, as families clambered aboard, thinking salvation was at hand. What followed was betrayal. Counts vary in detail, but most agree that as the boats pushed off, rebel forces opened fire. Some boats caught fire, others overturned. Many of the men were cut down on the riverbank or drowned in the water. Women and children, those who survived the chaos, were taken captive. The massacre at the river was seared into memory. For the British, it became a symbol of treachery. For rebels, it was a moment when vengeance overtook mercy. In the days that followed, the women and children captured at the river were held in a building known as the Bibiger, or House of the Ladies. There, they lived in cramped and stifling conditions, uncertain of their fate. Rumors swirled among the rebels. Some wanted to release them. Others demanded their execution as punishment for British atrocities elsewhere. The captives waited, their lives balanced on decisions made by men outside their prison walls. Meanwhile, British forces were advancing toward Kanpur. From Allahabad, a column under General Havelock fought its way up the Grand Trunk Road, defeating rebel detachments in fierce battles. News of their approach reached Kanpur in early July. For the rebels, fear grew that if the captives were freed, they might reveal information or inspire sympathy. The debate over their fate grew urgent. On July 15, 1857, a decision was made that would stain the rebellion forever. The women and children in the Bibigovo 100 souls were killed. Eyewitness accounts differ in detail, some describing swords, others stating that executioners hesitated and butchers were brought in. The aftermath was undeniable. Their bodies were thrown into a nearby well. When British forces entered Kanpur days later, they discovered the grisly scene. The well filled with corpses became a rallying cry for vengeance. Soldiers swore retribution, and reprisals against rebels and civilians alike were brutal. The massacre at Kanpur hardened attitudes on both sides, ensuring that the rebellion would be fought with little mercy. For the British public, news of Kanpur caused shock and outrage. Newspapers printed lurid accounts, some exaggerated, others true, of women and children slaughtered. The story fueled calls for vengeance and shaped British memory of 1857 as a revolt marked by barbarity. For Indians, the event was more complicated. Some saw it as an atrocity that tainted the cause of rebellion, others as a desperate act in a war already drenched in blood. But in June and July of 1857, for those trapped in Kanpur, there was no broader meaning, only hunger, thirst, fear, and finally, death. What began as a siege ended in massacre, and what might have been a story of survival became instead a wound that would scar the rebellion and the empire alike. And so, an unanswered question hangs: was the massacre at Kanpur the inevitable result of months of brutality on both sides, or was it the moment when the rebellion lost any chance of being remembered as a struggle for justice rather than vengeance? Asterisk. When the first reports of the Kanpur massacre reached British camps in July 1857, disbelief mingled with rage. The uprising had already been marked by brutality on both sides, but the deaths of women and children at the Bibiger shocked even hardened soldiers. For British officers, this was no longer simply a rebellion to be crushed. It became a matter of vengeance. For Indians, the tragedy created division. Some defended the rebels' actions as retaliation. Others condemned it as needless cruelty that weakened their cause. To understand how Kanpur unfolded, one must look closely at the dynamics within the city during the weeks leading up to the massacre. Nana Sahib, elevated as the leader of the rebellion in Kanpur, faced enormous pressures. He had allied himself with mutinous sepoys and with disaffected nobles of Awadh, but he lacked the organizational structure of a disciplined army. His authority rested on persuasion, not command. Different factions within the rebel camp pulled in different directions. Some urged leniency toward captives, arguing that releasing them would show the rebellion's moral strength. Others demanded blood, citing British reprisals elsewhere as justification. Nana Sahib himself seemed torn. On one hand, he had once cultivated friendships with British officials and likely feared the long-term consequences of killing innocents. On the other, he understood that the rebellion had reached a point where compromise seemed impossible. Havelock's relief column advanced from Allahabad. His control over events weakened. Rebels feared that if captives were freed, they might embolden the British or even expose rebel weaknesses. Inside, the bigger conditions were wretched. The building, never intended to house large numbers, became overcrowded and stifling. Over 100 women and children were confined there, guarded by sepoys and local retainers. Survivors who later wrote about the atmosphere described fear, heat, and despair. Food was scarce, water limited, and the uncertainty of their fate pressed on them constantly. They could hear the sounds of fighting in the distance, a grim reminder that relief might be near, but not near enough. Asterisk. When the decision came on July 15th to execute the captives, confusion and hesitation marked its implementation. Accounts from Indian witnesses suggest that sepoys themselves were reluctant, unwilling to slaughter women and children. Some refused outright. Ultimately, lower caste men, often described as butchers or professional executioners, were summoned to carry out the killings. The scene was chaotic and horrific, a breakdown of both discipline and humanity. The dead were disposed of in a well, their blood staining the floors of the Bibigar. Days later, when Havelock's column entered Kanpur, they found the evidence. Soldiers described the Bibigar's walls spattered with blood, strands of hair clinging to surfaces, and the well filled with decomposing bodies. The shock of the discovery hardened British resolve. Officers and men, already angered by months of rebellion, now swore vengeance on an unprecedented scale. Reprisals in Kanpur and surrounding districts were swift and merciless. Suspected rebels were rounded up, tried summarily, and executed. Some were hanged in public squares, their bodies left as warnings. Others were forced to lick blood-stained floors before being shot. The cycle of atrocity deepened, each act of violence feeding the next. Kanpur became a grim symbol of mutual hatred, where mercy had no place. For the British public, news of the massacre sparked outrage. Newspapers carried lurid accounts, sometimes embellished, of women violated and children butchered. Illustrations depicted scenes of horror, often exaggerated for dramatic effect. Shaping public opinion far from the actual events, Parliament debated the rebellion in tones of fury, and popular sentiment demanded retribution. Kanpur became shorthand for treachery, a rallying cry that justified the harshest measures against rebels. For Indians, reactions were divided. Some rebels believed the killings would justify revenge for British atrocities, such as those reported in villages and towns where civilians had been punished collectively. Others, however, recognized that the massacre weakened the rebellion's moral standing, both within India and abroad. Leaders who sought to frame the uprising as a just struggle against oppression found it harder to claim legitimacy after Kanpur. The massacre also revealed the fragile nature of leadership within the rebellion. Nana Sahib, thrust into prominence, lacked the authority to control all factions. His name became forever tied to the killings, though historians still debate whether he ordered them directly or was swept along by circumstances beyond his control. In the chaos of 1857, lines of responsibility blurred, but the consequences were stark. In the weeks after the massacre, Kanpur's landscape bore witness to the rebellion's violence. The entrenchment where the British had suffered so long stood in ruins, filled with shallow graves. The riverbank, where survivors had been cut down, still carried the scars of fire and blood. The Bibigar, with its stained walls, became infamous. The well, filled with the bodies of women and children, became a sight of mourning and anger. The events at Kanpur hardened both sides. For the British, it erased any remaining inclination toward leniency. Officers in later campaigns justified extreme reprisals by pointing to Kanpur arguing that mercy had no place in a war marked by such atrocities. For rebels, the British vengeance that followed only deepened resentment, convincing many that compromise was impossible. The rebellion became more bitter, more ruthless, and more tragic, yet beyond politics and symbolism. The human stories remained the most haunting. Letters and diaries from British survivors who lost family at Cawnpore reveal grief that words could scarcely contain. Indian oral traditions, passed down in villages, spoke of fear, of neighbors caught in impossible choices, of the weight of bloodshed that tainted all who witnessed it. The massacre at Cawnpore thus became more than an event, became a turning point in memory. For the British, it justified the empire's harsh reassertion of control. For Indians, it complicated the rebellion's legacy, a moment when righteous anger gave way to actions that could never be defended fully. And so, one question lingers, unresolved even today. Was Cawnpore a tragedy born of desperation and chaos? Or was it the moment when rebellion and empire alike surrendered humanity to vengeance? Asterisk, the fall of Cawnpore in July 1857 marked one of the rebellion's darkest moments. The massacre at the Bibigur, combined with the betrayal at the riverbank, seared itself into the memory of all who lived through the events or heard of them afterward. For the British, it became the ultimate symbol of treachery. For Indians, it was a tragedy that revealed both the rebellion's fury and its flaws. When Havelock's column entered the city on July 17th, the scene they encountered was beyond comprehension. The entrenchment was a charred ruin, its shallow graves disturbed by scavenging dogs. The riverbank still bore the blackened remains of boats destroyed during the survivors' attempted escape, and the Bickleritz walls stained with blood. The well filled with decomposing bodies was a spectacle that no British soldier could forget. The discovery enraged the relief force. Soldiers, hardened by months of marching and fighting in brutal conditions, were shaken by what they saw. Their grief and fury demanded an outlet, and it was civilians, suspected rebels, and prisoners who bore the brunt. Reprisals were swift and brutal. Men accused of complicity were hanged without trial. Others were forced to clean the blood-stained floors of the Bibigur before being executed. Punishments were carried out in public squares, designed to instill terror. Mercy vanished from British policy at Cawnpore. Vengeance ruled. The cycle of violence deepened as news spread across India. Cawnpore became a rallying cry for British soldiers and civilians alike. The phrase "Remember Cawnpore" echoed in letters, speeches, and newspapers, used to justify the harshest reprisals. To the British public back home, lurid newspaper accounts painted the rebellion as barbaric and inhuman, emphasizing the massacre of women and children. The empire's resolve to crush the uprising grew more uncompromising. For Nana Sahib, the events at Cawnpore were both a triumph and a disaster. In the short term, his role as leader of the rebellion in the region gave him prominence. Yet, the massacre tied his name irrevocably to atrocity. Even among rebels, opinions of him were divided. Some viewed him as a hero who defied the British at their most vulnerable point. Others condemned the killings as reckless, an act that ensured the rebellion would lose sympathy both in India and abroad. Nana Sahib himself vanished into history soon after, fleeing into Nepal as the rebellion collapsed. His ultimate fate remains uncertain, though British accounts long portrayed him as the villain of 1857. Inside India, memories of Cawnpore were complex. Among rebels and sympathizers, the killings were sometimes justified as retribution for British violence elsewhere. In villages where entire communities had been burned or executed in retaliation, Cawnpore was seen as part of the cycle of vengeance. Yet many Indians recoiled from the events, recognizing that the massacre tarnished the rebellions. Leaders who hoped to cast the uprising as a struggle for justice and sovereignty now faced accusations of barbarity. For the survivors, grief became the defining legacy. British families who lost wives, mothers, and children at the Big Ear carried scars that shaped their lives. Letters written afterward revealed a mixture of sorrow and bitterness, mourning loved ones while demanding retribution. Indian families too, though less often remembered in official accounts, bore losses, villages caught in reprisals, innocents executed without trial, homes burned in collective punishment. The tragedy at Cawnpore claimed victims on both sides. In ways often overlooked, the physical landscape of Cawnpore changed after the rebellion. The Bibigir itself was demolished by the British, its ruins replaced by a memorial garden. At its center stood an ornate Gothic screen and a statue of an angel erected over the well where the bodies had been thrown. To the British, it was a place of mourning and memory. To many Indians, it was a reminder of the rebellion's bloodiest consequences. The entrenchment, too, was preserved as a memorial, marked by plaques and monuments. Cawnpore became not just a town, but a site of memory that shaped imperial and nationalist narratives alike. In the decades that followed, Cawnpore remained central to the way 1857 was remembered. British accounts framed it as the epitome of rebel cruelty, used to justify both the harsh suppression of the uprising and the consolidation of the Raj afterward. Indian nationalist accounts, emerging in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, acknowledged the massacre, but often contextualized it as part of a wider struggle, arguing that British atrocities had fueled desperation and vengeance. The truth, as ever, lay in the messy overlap of both perspectives. The massacre also revealed the dangerous power of rumor, fear, and mistrust in times of war. The British believed Nana Sahib's promise of safe passage. The rebels believed that mercy would be met with treachery if relief forces arrived. Each side acted in anticipation of betrayal, and in doing so, made betrayal a reality. The riverbank and the Bigger became symbols of how rebellion can spiral beyond control, consuming both the guilty and the innocent. Amid the chaos of 1857, when much of northern India erupted into rebellion, one group of soldiers stood apart, the Gurkhas, drawn from the rugged hills of Nepal. These men had once been enemies of the British, fighting fiercely in the Anglo-Nepalese War of 1814 to 1816. The war ended with defeat for Nepal, but also with recognition of the Gurkhas' martial skill. The British, impressed by their discipline and tenacity, began recruiting them into the company's army. By 1857, Gurkha regiments had earned a reputation as loyal, efficient, and fearless. When rebellion spread across the Bengal army, many British officers feared that Gurkha loyalty would waver. After all, they too were Indian soldiers, far from their mountain homes, subject to foreign command. Yet the Gurkhas, for reasons both practical and cultural, remained steadfast. Their participation in suppressing the rebellion proved decisive, shaping not only the outcome of 1857, but also their long relationship with the British Empire. The story begins in the foothills of Nepal, where recruitment into the British Army had become both a livelihood and a point of pride. Gurkha soldiers were drawn largely from rural, agrarian backgrounds. Life in the hills was harsh, with limited farmland and few opportunities for advancement. Service in the company's regiments offered steady pay, rations, and the possibility of honor. Gurkha identity, rooted in traditions of martial valor, found resonance in military service. When mutiny broke out at Meerut and spread to Delhi, Gurkha regiments in Bengal were put to the test. At first, rumors swirled: would they join their fellow sepoys, or would they stand apart? British officers watched closely, uncertain of where loyalties lay. But in regiment after regiment, the Gurkhas chose discipline. Unlike the sepoys, their grievances were fewer. They had not been drawn into disputes over cartridges greased with cow and pig fat, which had sparked outrage among Hindu and Muslim sepoys alike. Their traditions, distinct from the plains of India, isolated them from some of the rebellion's religious tensions. One of the most famous Gurkha contributions came during the siege of Delhi, when British forces gathered on the ridge north of the city, preparing for the long assault. Gurkha battalions were among them. They manned trenches, stormed breaches, and fought in brutal street battles once the assault began. British officers praised their discipline, noting that in the heat of combat they remained steady where others faltered. The ridge, with its endless heat and cholera, tested every regiment Gurkhas endured. But perhaps the most remarkable story of Gurkha loyalty unfolded in the march toward Lucknow. After the massacre at Kanpur and the prolonged siege of the Residency, British commanders knew that reinforcing and eventually relieving Lucknow was essential. Alongside British troops and Sikh regiments, Gurkha battalions became the backbone of the relief columns. The march was grueling. Soldiers trekked through the heat of the Indian plains, burdened with equipment, rations, and ammunition. Every mile brought the threat of ambush as rebel detachments harried the columns from groves, villages, and riversides. The Gurkhas, accustomed to harsh terrain and relentless marches in their homeland, bore the strain with stoic endurance. Their kukri-scurved knives, carried as symbols of identity and weapons of war, became both practical tools and emblems of their distinctiveness. At Lucknow, Gurkha soldiers fought alongside British and Sikh regiments in some of the rebellion's most savage urban battles. Palaces, gardens, and mosques became fortresses. The Sikandar Bagh, where thousands of rebels made their stand, saw Gurkhas in the thick of the assault, storming walls and clearing courtyards. Their courage, combined with discipline, left a deep impression on British officers who had once doubted whether any Indian troops could be trusted. Yet, the story of the Gurkhas in 1857 is not one of simple loyalty. For many, the decision to remain with the British was shaped by survival and pragmatism. The rebellion was strongest in Bengal and Awadh, regions far from the Gurkha heartland. Aligning with the rebels would have meant joining a cause that had little connection to their own grievances. The British, by contrast, offered continuity pay, rations, and recognition. Gurkhas were not simply pawns of empire. They made a calculated choice in a moment of upheaval. Their loyalty came at a price. In village traditions and oral histories in Nepal, stories circulated of men who marched far into the plains, fought in strange lands, and never returned. Letters carried home spoke of heat, hunger, and wounds of comrades buried in foreign soil. The rebellion may have cemented the Gurkhas' reputation in British eyes, but for families in Nepal, it brought grief as well as honor. The Gurkhas' role also raises deeper questions about empire. Why did one group of Indian soldiers remain loyal when so many others rebelled? Was it cultural distance, military discipline, or the absence of direct grievances? Or was it, as some historians argue, a reminder that empire's strength often lay in exploiting divisions, recruiting one group to suppress another, weaving loyalty and mistrust into the fabric of colonial rule? By the end of 1857, the Gurkhas had secured their place in the imperial imagination. British accounts praised them as martial and faithful, contrasting them with the treacherous sepoys. This stereotype would shape recruitment policies for decades as the British classified communities into so-called martial races. For the Gurkhas, the rebellion of 1857 became a foundation for their long service in the British Army, stretching across continents and centuries. But in the rebellion itself, their march was a story of endurance, of choices made in a time when loyalty and betrayal blurred. They fought not for empire or rebellion in abstract, but for survival, for pay, and for the traditions of valor that defined their identity. And so, as the relief columns pushed toward Lucknow, The question remained, were the Gurkhas loyal because they believed in the British cause, or because they saw no future in joining a rebellion that was already tearing itself apart? Asterisk, as the rebellion dragged into late 1857, the role of the Gurkhas became more visible and more complicated. Their presence on the battlefield was undeniable, compact in stature, disciplined in drill, and carrying the distinctive kukri blade. They looked different from both British soldiers and the sepoys that were often sent to fight. To British officers, they became a reassurance in a time when trust in native troops had shattered. To rebels, they were seen as tradesmen who fought against their fellow Indians on behalf of the very empire that had subdued them only a generation earlier. The contrast between perception and reality was stark. For the Gurkhas themselves, loyalty to the British was less about ideology and more about necessity. Service in the company's regiments provided pay and stability that rural Nepal could not offer. The rebellion, centered in Bengal and Awadh, did not touch their villages in the high hills. They had little stake in the grievances over greased cartridges or annexed estates. To join the rebels would have meant abandoning steady livelihoods and aligning with causes that were not their own. Yet, in the march toward Lucknow and in other campaigns, the Gurkhas found themselves in the middle of brutal fighting. The relief of Lucknow in November was one of the rebellion's fiercest battles, and Gurkha battalions were at the forefront. British artillery battered palaces and mosques. Gurkhas stormed walls and barricades. The Kutas, more suited to close combat than long muskets, were feared in hand-to-hand fighting. British officers wrote in dispatches that when Gurkhas advanced, the rebels often broke ranks, knowing the assault would not stop until the position was taken. But the Gurkhas' loyalty was not always unquestioned. Rebel propaganda sometimes circulated through villages, warning Gurkhas that they were being used as tools of empire, that they would never be treated as equals. Even within British ranks, there was suspicion. Officers praised them as brave, but childlike. Others doubted whether they would remain reliable if the tide of battle turned. In this atmosphere of mistrust, every act of courage became a test. Every march, a demonstration of fidelity. One episode illustrates the strange position of the Gurjas. During the prolonged campaigns in Awadh in early 1858, Gurja regiments were often deployed to clear villages suspected of harboring rebels. For the British, this was a practical strategy. For the villagers, it was betrayal. To see men from another part of India foreign in language, dress, manner, burning homes, and confiscating grain was to see the rebellion not only as a fight against the British, but also against Indians allied to them. Oral traditions in Awadh speak bitterly of these encounters, describing Gurkha columns as relentless and merciless. Yet even within the Gurkha ranks, the war took its toll. Letters sent home few, though they were spoke of heat, disease, and exhaustion. Men unaccustomed to the burning plains longed for the cool air of the hills. Its casualties mounted from cholera and dysentery as much as from bullets. The sense of isolation deepened. They were far from home, fighting for pay, serving a foreign master, yet distrusted by the very officers who depended on them. Still, the Gurkhas endured. Their march became a study in resilience. At Delhi, they had manned the ridge. At Kanpur, they had fought in relief columns. At Lucknow, they had stormed palaces. Everywhere, their presence reassured the British and intimidated the rebels. British memoirs from the rebellion often highlight Gurkha courage, contrasting it with the supposed treachery of sepoys who mutinied. This contrast, though simplistic, became a powerful narrative in imperial memory, but loyalty had its ambiguities. The British rewarded Gurkha service with praise, but rarely with equality. Pay remained lower than that of British soldiers. Promotion beyond certain ranks was limited. The very qualities that were admired, endurance, discipline, martial spirit, were used to pigeonhole Gurkhas into a stereotype of the martial race, category that defined them not as individuals, but as instruments of empire. The rebellion of 1857 cemented this image, shaping recruitment for decades. For Nepal itself, the rebellion had mixed consequences. The government of Nepal, formerly independent but under heavy British influence, saw an opportunity to strengthen ties with the empire by supporting Gurkha service. Kathmandu's rulers allowed recruitment to continue, aware that it brought both revenue and prestige. At the same time, the loss of so many young men to foreign battlefields created strains in rural life. Families struggled without sons and fathers. Villages remembered with bitterness those who never returned. In India, the Gurkhas' march left behind complicated memories. In Awadh, they were remembered as enforcers of British will. In Punjab, where they sometimes served alongside Sikh regiments, they were seen as fellow soldiers in a complex mosaic of loyalties. In British accounts, they became almost mythical people who, unlike the sepoys, had not faltered. The rebellion of 1857 was not won by the British alone. It was suppressed through alliances Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, and others whose interests did not align with the rebels. The Gurkhas' march was one strand in this web of loyalties and betrayals. For every act of discipline that won them praise, there was a village that cursed their presence, a family in Nepal that mourned their absence by the spring of 1858. As the rebellion faltered, the Gurkhas had established themselves firmly in the British imagination. Their loyalty was celebrated, their image romanticized. But beneath the surface, their survival strategy revealed a deeper truth. In a rebellion that divided India, the Gurkhas chose pragmatism. They fought not for empire or for rebellion, but for the endurance of their people, for pay that sustained their villages, and for the traditions of valor that gave meaning to their service. And so, one must ask, did the Gurkhas truly march out of loyalty to the British, or did they march because in the brutal calculus of 1857, betrayal of one cause was the only way to ensure survival in another? By early 1858, the rebellion was beginning to collapse, but the campaigns that brought it down were some of the most brutal of the entire conflict. In these final months, the Gurkhas played a role that cemented their reputation in British eyes and fixed their place in the memory of 1857. From Delhi to Awadh, from the sieges of palaces to the clearing of villages, the Gurkhas marched, fought, and endured. The relief and subsequent evacuation of Lucknow in November 1857 had already shown their value. As British forces regrouped for a renewed offensive in early 1858, Kush battalions once again formed the backbone of key operations. Alongside Sikh and British regiments, they advanced through Awadh, capturing strongholds and clearing the countryside of rebel detachments. The fighting was relentless. Unlike the great set-piece battles of European wars, the campaigns in Awadh often meant skirmishes in fields, sieges of fortified houses, and ambushes along dusty roads. Rebels fortified temples, palaces, and even humble mud-walled villages, forcing attackers into close combat. Here, the Gurkhas excelled. Her Kuga's short, curved blades were both feared and symbolic. For British officers, the sight of Gurkhas charging into narrow lanes, blades flashing, became a shorthand for determination. For rebels and villagers, it was a reminder that not all Indian soldiers had joined the cause. Yet, the role of the Gurkhas in these campaigns was not only military, but also symbolic. For the British, they represented the possibility of loyalty amidst mutiny, proof that empire could endure if it found the right allies. For rebels, their presence was betrayal, a painful reminder that the rebellion was not universally supported. Oral traditions in Awadh often speak of the Gurkhas with bitterness, remembering them as relentless enforcers who fought for pay rather than principle. The contradictions of their service became especially clear in the recapture of Lucknow in March 1858. After months of preparation, Sir Colin Campbell launched a full-scale offensive to retake the city. Once again, Gurkha regiments fought at the forefront. The assault was devastating. Palaces reduced to rubble. Gardens turned into killing grounds. Mosques scarred by cannon fire. In dispatches, Campbell praised the Gurkhas for their discipline, noting that they held ground even under the heaviest fire. But in the city itself, civilians saw them as part of the army that destroyed Lucknow's beauty. For the Gurkhas themselves, the campaign was both grueling and defining. Letters carried back to Nepal spoke of hunger, of long marches through hostile countryside, of comrades lost to cholera or shot in the streets of Lucknow. Some wrote of pride in their endurance, others of longing for their mountain villages, far removed from the plains where they now fought. Many never returned home. Their names live only in regimental rolls and faded gravestones. The aftermath of the rebellion brought recognition. British officers lauded the Gurkhas, declaring them among the most loyal and reliable troops in India. In military reports and in parliamentary debates in London, they were singled out as proof that empire could depend on certain martial races. This idea that some communities were naturally suited to soldiering, while others were prone to treachery, became a cornerstone of colonial policy. The Gurkhas, like the Sikhs and some Pathan groups, were elevated as loyal warriors, while the Bengal sepoys were stigmatized as unreliable. This classification shaped recruitment for decades. The British increased their reliance on Gurkha regiments, expanding their numbers and ensuring their presence in future campaigns across the empire from Afghanistan to Burma. From the trenches of World War I to the jungles of World War II, the rebellion of 1857 had secured the Gurkhas a permanent place in imperial armies. But recognition did not mean equality. Gurkhas remained underpaid compared to British soldiers, with limited opportunities for advancement. Their service was valued, but always within boundaries set by colonial hierarchy. Praise for their loyalty often masked exploitation, reducing them to stereotypes rather than acknowledging them as individuals. The very loyalty that had saved them from suspicion during the rebellion also trapped them in the role the British had created for them. In Nepal, the legacy of 1857 was equally complex. The government in Kathmandu, officially independent, had strengthened its ties with Britain by allowing Gurkha recruitment. This relationship brought prestige and financial benefit, but it also drained rural communities of young men. Families remembered the rebellion not as a story of glory, but as years when sons disappeared into foreign wars, sometimes never to return. Oral histories in Nepal tell of women who raised families alone, of fields left untended, of letters carried back by survivors describing comrades buried in India's plains. The memory of the Gurkhas in 1857 thus became layered in British accounts. They were the faithful allies who had stood firm when others mutinied. In Indian memories, especially in Awadh, they were outsiders who had crushed rebellion in service of empire. In Nepal, they were both honored and mourned, symbols of pride and of loss. Even today, their story raises questions. Why did they remain loyal when others rebelled? Was it discipline, culture, or simply pragmatism? Did they believe in the empire? Or did they see service as a survival strategy in a time of upheaval? Historians continue to debate these questions, but the answers may lie in the very complexity of human choices during crisis. The rebellion of 1857 ended not because of British strength alone, but because the empire managed to secure allies like the Gurkhas. Their march from Delhi to Lucknow and beyond demonstrated both their endurance and their ambiguous role in history. They were soldiers caught between loyalty and betrayal, between survival and service, between their mountain homes and the plains. of India. And so, the story of the Gurkhas in 1857 ends with an unresolved thought. Were they loyal warriors who saved an empire, or were they simply survivors of history, making choices in a world where betrayal of one cause was the only way to ensure the survival of another? In the tapestry of the 1857 rebellion, few names shine as brightly as that of Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi. To the British, she was a dangerous rebel queen who defied their authority. To Indians, she became an enduring symbol of resistance, remembered in poetry, legend, and song. Her story was not just about one woman's courage, but about the collision of empire and sovereignty, of gender and power. In a moment when history turned violently, Jhansi was a small, princely state in Bundelkhand, ruled by Raja Gangadhar Rao, until his death in 1853. Childless, the Raja had adopted a boy, Damodar Rao, shortly before his death. But the British, invoking the doctrine of lapse policy that allowed them to annex states without a biological heir, refused to recognize the adoption. Lord Dalhousie, Governor General of India, declared Jhansi annexed to the East India Company. For the widowed Queen Lakshmi Bai, this was more than political humiliation. It was personal betrayal. Her right to rule, her duty to her people, and her son's inheritance were stripped away with the stroke of a pen. For 4 years, Lakshmi Bai lived under British oversight. Her role diminished. Yet, she did not retreat into obscurity. Accounts describe her as disciplined, intelligent, and strong-willed. She trained in horse riding, swordsmanship, in military exercises, skills unusual for a woman of her time, but essential in a land where sovereignty could not be assumed, only defended. Her palace became a place of quiet resistance, where loyalty to Jhansi was nurtured even under the shadow of annexation. When the rebellion of 1857 erupted, Jhansi was drawn inexorably into the storm. In June, mutiny broke out among the sepoys stationed in the city. British officers and their families, caught unprepared, sought refuge in the fort. The mutineers promised safe conduct, but soon turned on them. Most were killed, leaving Jhansi in rebel hands. The Rani, whose role in the killings remains debated, suddenly found herself at the center of events. British accounts accused her of complicity. Indian traditions insist she was either powerless to prevent the massacre or actively tried to restrain it. The truth is murky, but what followed is clear. Lakshmi Bai assumed control of Jhansi. With British authority absent and rebellion spreading, she had little choice. To surrender would mean dishonor and perhaps death. To rule meant survival. From June 1857 onward, the Rani transformed from widow to warrior queen. She raised troops, fortified the city, and proclaimed her commitment to defend Jhansi. Rebels from surrounding districts rallied to her banner. Artisans crafted weapons, farmers supplied grain, and the palace became a command center. Rani rode daily through the city, inspecting defenses, meeting commanders, and ensuring discipline. Eyewitnesses recalled her clad in male attire for battle, riding astride her horse, carrying a sword at her side. Her leadership was tested quickly. In September, a rival prince, the Nawab of Orkha, sought to seize Jhansi under the pretext of restoring order. The Rani met him not with diplomacy, but with force. Her troops defeated his incursion, demonstrating that Jhansi was no longer a passive prize, but a fortress under determined rule. This victory strengthened her position and inspired loyalty among her people. Yet the shadow of British retribution loomed. Lakshmi Bai knew that when the company recovered from the shock of rebellion, they would march on Jhansi. Every day became preparation for the inevitable siege. Cannons were mounted on the walls, trenches dug, and supplies stockpiled. The Rani balanced governance with war-making, ensuring that both civilians and soldiers were sustained. The British, meanwhile, debated her role. Some officers saw her as the mastermind behind rebellion in Bundelkhand, a dangerous symbol of female defiance who had to be crushed. Others doubted whether she truly intended revolt or was swept along by events. Either way, her fate was sealed. The empire could not tolerate a queen who ruled without its sanction. By early 1858, British forces under Sir Hugh Rose advanced toward Jhansi. Rose was an experienced commander, methodical and relentless. His column, composed of British, Indian, and Gurkha troops, cut through Bundelkhand, defeating rebel detachments and burning villages suspected of aiding the Rani. As the column drew near, Jhansi braced for siege. Inside the fort, preparations were intense. Women joined men in carrying water, preparing food, and even assisting in defense. Children were taught to stay hidden during bombardments. The Rani herself became the embodiment of resolve, appearing daily on the battlements, rallying her troops with promises of honor and survival. Songs later composed about her recall her cry, "We will fight for Jhansi until our last breath." The siege began in March 1858. British artillery thundered against the fort's walls, sending stones crashing into the city below. Fires broke out, smoke rising above temples and markets. Rebel gunners returned fire, but their weapons were fewer and less accurate. For 2 weeks, the city endured bombardment, hunger, and mounting casualties. Through it all, the Rani refused to yield. She rode along the ramparts, sword in hand, urging her soldiers to resist. When sections of the wall collapsed under bombardment, she directed reinforcements to hold the breaches. Her presence transformed despair into determination. Even British officers later admitted her courage, describing her as the most formidable leader they faced in the rebellion. But courage could not alter the imbalance of power. By early April, breaches in the fort grew wider, and British troops prepared for the final assault. Inside Jhansi, the defenders knew the end was near. Yet, surrender was never an option. The Rani, in full battle attire, prepared to fight to the last dot. And so, as the cannons roared and the walls trembled, one question weighed heavily over Jhansi. Would Lakshmi Bai, the queen who refused to surrender, fall with her city, or would she find a way to defy even the empire's final assault? Asterisk. The siege of Jhansi in March 1858 became one of the most dramatic episodes of the rebellion. For 2 weeks, Sir Hugh Rose's column bombarded the city relentlessly, hammering at its walls with heavy artillery. Smoke rose over Bundelkhand, dry plains as fires burned inside the fort. The sound of cannon fire echoed across villages for miles. To those who lived nearby, it seemed as though the earth itself was trembling. Inside the city, life was a mixture of defiance and desperation. The fort, perched on a rocky hill, dominated Jhansi, but it was not invulnerable. Its medieval walls, though thick, were no match for modern siege guns. Each day, new cracks appeared, bastions crumbled, and rubble piled high. Still, the Rani of Jhansi refused to yield. Lakshmi Bai led by presence, not only by command. She rode along the battlements on her horse Sarangi, her sword glinting in the sun, her face resolute. Soldiers and civilians alike drew strength from her visibility. Women who might otherwise have hidden in fear joined the effort, carrying water to extinguish fires, molding gunpowder into cartridges, and preparing food for exhausted defenders. Songs later remembered her as the queen who became a soldier, a widow who became a commander. The defenders fought with whatever they had. Cannons mounted on the ramparts fired back at the British, though their powder was limited and their shot often crude. Muskets cracked from loopholes in the walls. Archers even appeared in the fray, sending arrows into the British lines, a reminder of the city's blend of tradition and necessity. Each day of resistance seemed a miracle, yet also a step closer to the inevitable breach. Sir Hugh Rose, methodical as ever, tightened the noose. He directed his artillery against key bastions, widening the cracks. His infantry probed the defenses, testing the strength of the garrison. Reports from British officers described the defenders' tenacity with grudging admiration. The Rani herself was seen on the walls, encouraging her men with great bravery. Such testimony, though written by her enemies, immortalized her as one of the rebellion's fiercest figures. Inside the fort, the atmosphere grew grim. Food supplies dwindled, water was rationed, and casualties mounted. Its hospitals overflowed with the wounded, tended by women and priests who lacked medical training but worked tirelessly. Bodies were buried hastily, sometimes in the very courtyards of homes. Yet despair never fully took hold, for the Rani's presence infused courage. Asterisk.